Victor Blackwell's fist came down on the table so hard that the oil lamp jumped and nearly tipped. "Sign it," he said, "or I'll make sure every man in this territory knows you hired a woman to run your books, and that she's been stealing from you since the day she arrived." Caleb Rourke didn't move. He stood on the other side of the table with his hat in his hand and his jaw set, like a man who had already decided he wasn't going to flinch regardless of what came next. But the paper was right there between them. A deed transfer, already filled out, already dated. And Eliza Whitmore could see from across the room that Caleb's name had been printed at the bottom in someone else's handwriting. Victor had forged it before he even walked through the door. He'd already decided how this was going to end before he'd said a single word. Eliza stood very still near the doorway. Her hands were steady. Her face gave nothing away. But her mind was already moving. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a person who had already lost almost everything, and you felt that particular kind of rage that sits behind your sternum and doesn't go anywhere, then you already know what kind of story this is. Hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe and follow along, because this is only the beginning. Gates. The morning Eliza Whitmore came to Red Hollow, she almost didn't get off the stage. She'd been watching the town through the window for the last 10 minutes of the ride, taking its measure the way she always measured unfamiliar places, by what people did when they thought no one was looking. What she saw wasn't encouraging. Two men outside the feed store stopped talking the moment the stage rolled past and just stared, arms crossed, the way men stared at things they'd already decided they didn't want. A woman hanging laundry on a line behind the hotel paused with a sheet in her hands and watched without pretending not to. A boy of maybe 9 or 10 sat on the post office steps and pointed. She had been pointed at before. It still landed somewhere unpleasant, somewhere below the collarbone. The driver called the stop. Eliza picked up her bag, one bag, worn brown leather with a brass clasp that didn't quite close all the way anymore, and stepped down onto the street. The dust came up around her boots. She'd worn her second-best dress for the arrival because her best one had a torn hem she hadn't had time to fix, and in that moment, standing in the middle of Red Hollow's main street with half a dozen people openly watching her, she was glad she hadn't bothered. The dress wouldn't have made any difference. They weren't looking at what she was wearing. They were looking at what she was, a woman, traveling alone, arriving with a single bag and no man beside her and no explanation that they could see. She had a letter. That was what she had. A letter from a man named Harding, who ran the employment office in Cheyenne, telling her that Caleb Rourke of the Double R Ranch outside Red Hollow was looking for a ranch manager's assistant with experience in accounts and supply coordination, and that her application had been accepted provisionally, subject to a face-to-face meeting. Provisionally. She had held on to that word for 2 weeks on the road, and she was still holding on to it now, because provisional was better than nothing, and nothing was what she'd had before she got the letter. She crossed the street toward the hotel to ask directions. The woman at the desk, middle-aged, dark-haired, with the particular expression of someone who had made up their mind about a situation before it had fully presented itself, looked Eliza up and down and said, "You're looking for the Double R." It wasn't a question. "I am," Eliza said. "You the one Rourke hired for the books?" "I'm the one he's considering." The woman's expression shifted slightly, something between skepticism and pity. "Word gets around," she said. "Caleb Rourke doesn't hire women. Hasn't hired much of anyone in 2 years. Town's been talking since the letter went out." She leaned forward a fraction. "I'll give you the directions because it's my job. But I'll also tell you, for free, that the man you're going to see has buried a wife and lost 2 ranch hands to accidents in 3 years, and he hasn't been what you'd call welcoming to anyone since. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand you're warning me," Eliza said. "Thank you for that. I'll still need the directions." The woman gave them. Eliza thanked her again and went back out into the street. She stood for a moment with the directions in her head and the sun already working at the back of her neck, and let herself feel, just briefly, what she actually felt, which was tired. Not road tired, though, she was that too. She was tired in a deeper way, the kind that comes from having to prove yourself in every new room you walk into. from knowing that the first thing anyone sees when they look at you is not your competence or your record or the 10 years of hard-won experience that had brought you to this particular street in this particular town. The first thing they saw was that she was a woman doing something they thought she shouldn't be doing, and everything she accomplished after that would be measured against their surprise rather than against any reasonable standard. She knew this. She had known it for years. Knowing it didn't make it lighter to carry. She picked up her bag and started walking toward the edge of town where the road branched south toward the double R. The ranch was 3 miles out, and she walked all 3 of them. She'd been offered a ride from a man with a wagon who'd pulled up alongside her about a mile in, a heavy-set man with a sun-damaged face and small eyes that moved over her in a way she didn't like before he'd said a single word. He'd offered the ride pleasantly enough, but she'd declined, and he'd pulled away without pressing it, and she was grateful for both those things. She arrived at the gate of the double R with dust on her boots and sweat on her back and her hair working loose from its pins, and she stood there for a moment looking at the place before she went through. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. The main house was solid and well-built, though it needed paint on the south side where the weather had gotten at it. The barn was in good shape. The fencing she could see was maintained. There were horses in the near corral, 4 of them, good animals, well kept, and a bunkhouse to the east that looked like it hadn't had more than 1 or 2 occupants in a while. The whole place had the feel of something that had been carefully managed but was slowly being managed by fewer and fewer hands. She unlatched the gate and went in. The man she assumed was Caleb Rourke was coming out of the barn when she crossed the yard. He stopped when he saw her. He was tall, rangy, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that made it hard to be sure. He was carrying a bridle, and he didn't put it down. He just stood there and looked at her the way people in this town apparently looked at things, as if looking hard enough might cause the thing to explain itself. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I'm Eliza Whitmore, from Cheyenne. The employment office sent me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Harding told me the name," he said finally. "He didn't tell me anything else." "I didn't ask him to," she said. Something moved in his face, not quite amusement, but in that direction. "You walked from town. The stage doesn't come out this far. There's usually someone to pick up new hires." "I didn't know that," she said, "and I didn't want to wait." He was quiet for another moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but wasn't warm either. The kind of quiet that was its own kind of test. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." She followed him into the house. It was clean, or clean enough, the kind of clean that a man manages when he's trying, which is not the same as the clean that happens naturally when a household has more than one person in it. There were papers on the table near the window, supply records by the look of them, stacked but not organized. There was a coat on a hook by the door that had been there so long it had taken the shape of the hook. On the wall near the kitchen, there was a photograph in a plain wood frame, a woman with dark hair and a quiet expression. And Caleb didn't look at it when he passed it, which told Eliza more than looking at it would have. He made the coffee. She sat at the table without being told to. "You've managed accounts before," he said. It was the beginning of an interview disguised as a statement. "For 8 years," she said. "The last position was a cattle operation in Nebraska. Before that, I worked supply coordination for a mining company out of Denver. I've also done payroll, vendor contracts, and I helped draft 3 land agreements that held up in territorial court." He set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table with his own. "Why'd you leave Nebraska?" "The operation closed. The owner died without a clear will, and his sons had different ideas about what to do with the property." "And before that? Denver?" "The mine played out," she said. "That's the nature of mining." He looked at her steadily. "You've been in 2 places that stopped needing you." "I've been in 2 places that stopped existing," she said. "There's a difference." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, one of the horses made a sound and then was quiet again. "The work here is real," he said after a while. "It's not just numbers on a page. The ranch runs short-handed, and I need someone who can look at what we have, figure out what we need, and tell me honestly when the numbers don't add up instead of making them add up on paper, so I don't worry. I've had one man who did that, made the numbers look better than they were. Took me 8 months to find out, and it nearly cost me the herd." "I don't do that," Eliza said. "Everyone says that." Then ask me to look at your records right now, she said. Whatever you've got on that table, give me an hour, and I'll tell you what's actually there. He looked at the stack of papers by the window. He looked back at her. He pushed his chair back and got up and brought the stack to the table and set it between them. 40 minutes, he said. I've got a fence line to check. He went out. She started reading. Oh. When he came back 43 minutes later, she had the papers organized into 4 separate piles with a sheet of her own paper on top of each one, summarizing what was in the pile and what the problems were. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table. You're overpaying your feed supplier by about 12%, she said, without looking up from the last page she was reading. Someone negotiated that contract in a hurry and didn't compare prices. Your winter hay estimate for last year was 15% lower than what you actually used, which means if this winter runs the same, you'll come up short in February unless you order more now while the price is still fair. Your payroll records for the last hired hand, Dawes, it says here, show he was paid for 6 weeks, but your supply log only shows his name on the work roster for 4. Either he worked off-site those 2 weeks and nobody recorded it, or someone made an error, or something else happened that I don't have enough information to understand yet. She set the last page down and looked at him. He was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. The Dawes thing, he said slowly. He worked the East Pasture for 2 weeks. I forgot to update the main roster. That's my error. Then that's one less problem, she said. The other 2 are still there. He came fully into the room and stood looking at the 4 piles on his table. He picked up one of her summary sheets and read it. He set it down. He picked up another. You did all this in 40 minutes, he said. 43, she said. I'm a little slower than I used to be. He looked at her then with an expression she hadn't seen from anyone in this town yet. Not the appraising look of someone deciding whether to trust her. Not the skeptical look of someone already decided they wouldn't. Something more like recalibration. Like a man who had built a wall against a certain kind of expectation and was now standing in front of a reality that required him to rethink the wall. Room and board are included, he said. The guest room is in the back. Pay is 1st and 15th. I don't require formal dress for work, but I do require people to be on time and to tell me the truth, even when it's inconvenient. I can do that, she said. One more thing, he said, and his voice shifted just slightly, something tighter underneath the words. People in town are going to talk. They already were before you got here, probably. I can't stop that. What I can tell you is that what happens on this ranch is my business and yours and nobody else's. If you can live with the talk, you can stay. If it bothers you past a point you can stand, you should probably tell me now. Eliza thought about the woman at the hotel desk, the men outside the feed store, the boy who pointed. Mr. Rourke, she said, I've been talked about in 6 states. I'm still here. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Start Monday, he said. That gives you the weekend to get your things settled. She nodded. She began gathering the papers back into the 4 piles she'd made, keeping them organized because that was simply how she did things, and she didn't notice until she was halfway through that he was still watching her. Not with the evaluating look this time, but with something quieter than that. Something that was almost, in a very restrained and carefully contained way, close to relief. She spent the weekend in the one decent room at the hotel in Red Hollow, and she spent it mostly working. There was a letter to write to her sister in Kansas City. Not a long one, because there wasn't much to say that would be welcome. Agnes had been after her for 3 years to stop moving around and come back to Kansas City and take the position at the dry goods store where Agnes's husband had a connection. Agnes meant it kindly. Agnes had never understood that kindly was not the same as right, and Eliza had long ago stopped trying to explain the difference without it turning into an argument. She wrote the letter, said she'd found something that might work out, and didn't mention the town's reception, or the man with the small eyes and the wagon, or the way the hotel woman had looked at her. Agnes would only worry, and Agnes's worry had a way of becoming Agnes's recommendation that Eliza come home, and Eliza wasn't going to do that. She also made a list. She made lists the way other people made prayers. Not because she was certain they'd work, but because the act of making them was its own kind of steadying. The list was of things she needed to understand about the Double R operation, questions to ask when she had the access and the standing to ask them, gaps in the record she'd already seen that needed filling in. She went through it twice, added 2 more items, then folded it and put it in the front pocket of her bag where it would be easy to reach. Monday morning, she was at the ranch gate at 7 sharp. Caleb was in the yard already, which she would later understand was simply how he was. A man who got up before the sun had fully committed to rising and didn't think of it as anything remarkable. He gave her the full run of the records room, which was a small space off the main hall that had clearly been used for storage for a while before anyone thought to put a desk in it. There were boxes she'd need to go through, files that hadn't been organized since before the last ranch manager had left, which by the date she could see had been almost 2 years ago. There was a ledger that had been started and then abandoned partway through, the entries getting sparser toward the end, the handwriting changing slightly as if the person writing had been tired or under pressure or both. She didn't ask about any of that yet. She just started. 3 hours in, Caleb came to the doorway and looked at what she'd done and said, "You eat?" "Not since this morning," she said, not looking up. "That was 3 hours ago." "I know." He went away and came back with bread and cold beef and more coffee, and he set it on the corner of the desk and left again without making it into anything. She ate while she worked. It wasn't until later that she thought about how that was, and how unusual it was in her experience. A man who brought food without requiring acknowledgement for it, who didn't need the bringing to be a moment. By the end of the first week, she had gone through every record in that room. By the end of the second week, she had begun to see the full shape of what the ranch was. Not just financially, but operationally, the patterns in what worked and what didn't, where the inefficiencies were, and what was causing them, and which of them could actually be fixed. She also began to see the shape of the town around the ranch, which was a different kind of understanding. It came in pieces. A comment from the feed merchant when she went in to start renegotiating the supply contract, a long pause after she explained she was from the R, and then a question about whether Caleb was doing the negotiating or whether he'd just sent her as a messenger. A conversation between 2 women in the dry goods store that stopped abruptly when Eliza came through the door. A man named Greer, who came out to the ranch on what he said was a social call, but spent most of it looking around the property with eyes that counted things, and when he left he said to Caleb, not quite loudly enough, something that included the phrase, his situation, in a way that made Caleb's expression go flat and stay flat for the rest of the afternoon. She filed it all away. She didn't have the full picture yet, but she was starting to understand what the picture might be. The first time she met Victor Blackwell was in the street outside the telegraph office, and she hadn't known who he was until after. He was a man of perhaps 55, well-dressed in the way that men who want you to register their money are well-dressed, with a thick silver watch chain and boots that had never seen ranch work. He had a wide, genial face and the kind of practiced smile that sits slightly ahead of whatever the person is actually feeling. He'd been coming out of the telegraph office as she was going in, and he'd held the door with a small, courteous gesture and said something pleasant about the weather, and she'd thanked him and gone inside. The telegraph operator, a thin young man named Purcell, who had so far been neither friendly nor unfriendly, just neutral in the way of someone who dealt with many different people and had learned to stay in the middle, watched the man walk past the window and said, without being asked, "That's Victor Blackwell." He said it the way you'd say a name that had weight to it, the way you'd say it to make sure someone else knew the weight was there. "He owns the bank?" Eliza asked. She'd seen the name on the building 2 streets over. "Owns the bank, has a stake in the freight operation, owns 3 parcels of land east of town, and has an interest in about half the businesses on this street one way or another." Purcell paused. "He's been after the Rourke property for about 4 years, offering to buy, being declined. Why does he want it particularly?" Purcell looked at her for a moment, that neutral expression shifting slightly toward something more careful. "Water rights," he said. "The R sits on the cleanest year-round creek in this part of the territory. Whoever controls that water controls about 12,000 acres of grazing land that's currently dependent on it." He slid the telegraph form across the counter toward her. "You'll want to fill that out." She filled it out. She sent the telegram she'd come to send. She thanked Purcell and went back out into the street. Blackwell was standing maybe 50 feet away, talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. As she came out the door, he turned and looked at her, and even at that distance she could see that he'd already been told who she was. The information had reached him fast, faster than she would have expected. And the way he looked at her now was different from the way he'd looked at her at the door. Not hostile. Something more considered than that. She met his eyes briefly and walked in the other direction. Walking back to where she'd tied her horse, she ran through what Purcell had told her and added it to everything else she'd been collecting. And by the time she was mounted and headed back toward the Double R, she had a clearer sense of the situation than she'd had that morning, and none of it was reassuring. A man with that kind of money and that many connections and a 4-year fixation on a single piece of property was not a man who was going to stop just because Caleb Rourke said no. He was going to keep looking for the right lever to push. The question was which lever he'd decided to use next. She had an uncomfortable feeling, riding back through the afternoon, that she was about to find out. What she found out came not from Blackwell directly, but from a woman named Ruth Harmon, who showed up at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning about 6 weeks into Eliza's time at the Double R. Ruth Harmon was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, and she introduced herself as the wife of Thomas Harmon, whose property bordered the Double R to the east. She'd brought a jar of preserved peaches, which she set on the kitchen table like a reason for the visit, though Eliza could see within 30 seconds that the peaches were not the reason. Caleb was out working the south pasture. Eliza made coffee. Ruth Harmon sat across the table and looked at Eliza with the focused attention of a woman taking very careful measure of something. "You've been here 6 weeks," Ruth said. "About that," Eliza said. "You're not what we expected." "I know," Eliza said. "What did you expect?" Ruth considered. "Someone easier to dismiss," she said, and said it without apology, which Eliza respected. "There's been talk." "I've heard some of it." "You haven't heard all of it." Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Blackwell's been talking, not publicly, not in a way anyone can point to, but he's been talking, saying that Caleb has lost his judgment, saying that he's let some woman from outside come in and get her hands on his finances, and that it's going to end badly for everyone who's counting on the Double R to stay solvent." She paused. "He's laying the ground for something. Thomas thinks he's going to make a move on the property before winter." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Does Caleb know you're here?" she asked. "Caleb knows," Ruth said. "I'm here because Thomas thought one of us should talk to you directly, and I agreed to be the one. We've watched Blackwell take 3 ranches in this valley in 10 years. Pressure, legal maneuvering, debt he somehow had a hand in creating. The Prestons, the Garvey family, and the Aldersons 2 years back. Once he gets his sights on something, he tends to get it." "But he hasn't gotten the Double R," Eliza said. "Not yet," Ruth said. "Caleb is stubborn enough and solvent enough to have held him off, but Caleb's been doing it alone. And now there's you, and Blackwell doesn't like it." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I'm going to be direct with you. Are you planning to stay?" It was the honest question underneath everything else, and Eliza thought about how to answer it. "I came here for a job," she said. "The job is real and the work is meaningful and I'm good at it. Whether I stay depends on a lot of things I can't fully predict from where I'm sitting right now." She paused. "But I'm not the kind of person who leaves when things get complicated. That's the most honest answer I can give you." Ruth Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, picked up her coffee cup, and drank from it. "Good," she said. "Then you should probably know everything Thomas and I know about Victor Blackwell's business practices. Because it's not just pressure and legal maneuvering. There's more to it than that, and most people in this valley are too scared to say so out loud." She started talking. Eliza listened. Outside, the wind picked up and the day moved forward, and by the time Ruth Harmon picked up her jar of peaches and went back to her wagon, Eliza knew 3 things with certainty. 1. Victor Blackwell was not just a businessman who wanted valuable land. He was systematic, and he was patient, and he had already heard a lot of people who had believed themselves too solid to be moved. 2. Caleb Rourke had no idea how close the next move was coming. 3. If someone didn't start documenting what Blackwell had done and was doing, with the kind of detail that could be taken to someone with actual authority, then the Double R was not going to survive the year. She picked up her pencil when Ruth left and opened a clean page in her personal ledger. Not the ranch ledger, her own. And she wrote a single line at the top. What we know. What we can prove. What we need. Then she started writing. The page she'd titled What We Know, What We Can Prove, What We Need. had 3 entries on it the night Ruth Harmon left, and 14 by the end of the week. Eliza wasn't working from instinct alone. She was working from pattern recognition, which was something different, something she'd developed over years of looking at numbers that didn't quite add up and tracing them backward until she found the place where they'd been made not to add up. The same skill that told her a feed contract was overpriced by 12% told her, when she looked at the timeline Ruth had laid out, that the 3 ranches Blackwell had acquired in 10 years hadn't simply failed. They'd been helped toward failure. The Prestons had taken out a loan from Blackwell's bank when their well went dry, and the well had gone dry the same summer a new irrigation channel was dug on land. Blackwell already owned 2 miles upstream. The Garvey family had lost a contract for beef supply to the territorial fort, a contract they'd held for 6 years, and the loss had come 3 weeks after they turned down Blackwell's first offer on their land. The Aldersons had simply been outmaneuvered legally, a boundary dispute that had somehow found its way to a judge who, by Eliza's count from the public records Purcell had let her look at, had ruled in favor of Blackwell's interests in 4 separate cases over 8 years. None of it was proof by itself. That was the problem. Individually, each piece looked like bad luck or business or the ordinary grinding way that things sometimes went wrong for people. Taken together, the shape was unmistakable. But shape wasn't evidence, and evidence was what she needed. She kept writing. Caleb noticed, the way he noticed most things, quietly, without making it into a confrontation. He came into the records room one evening when she was still at the desk past dark with the lamp turned up, and he looked at the 2 ledgers open in front of her, the ranch ledger on the left, her personal one on the right. And he didn't ask right away. He made coffee. He brought her a cup. He sat in the chair near the door that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, where he sat when he wanted to talk without it being a formal conversation. "You're keeping 2 sets of records," he said. "The ranch records are the ranch records," she said. "The other is mine." "What's in it?" She looked at him across the desk. She'd learned in 8 weeks something of how to read Caleb Rourke, which was not easy because he ran most of what he felt through a very narrow opening before it got to the surface. What she could see now was that he was asking the question seriously and that he already had some suspicion of the answer. "Everything Ruth Harmon told me," she said, "and everything I've been able to confirm since." He was quiet. "You talked to her before she came out here," Eliza said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact she was putting on the table." "I asked her to come," he said. "I wanted someone to explain the situation to you who wasn't me." "Why not you?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a thing he did when he was finding the precise words for something he didn't usually say out loud. "Because when I talk about Blackwell, it comes out wrong," he said. "Too much anger in it makes me sound like a man with a personal problem instead of a man with a real one. I didn't want you to hear it that way and decide before you'd had a chance to look at it clearly." She thought about that. It was, she realized, a more self-aware thing to say than she'd have expected from him 6 weeks ago, when she was still learning which silences meant he was uncomfortable and which meant he was just thinking. "I've looked at it clearly," she said. "The picture is not good." "No," he said. "It's not." "He's going to move before winter," Ruth thinks. Ruth's probably right. He always moves before winter. Ranchers are most stretched in the fall, supplies going out, cash tight, until the cattle sales close. It's the best time to squeeze someone. He set down the cup. "What I don't know is what form it's going to take this time. With the Aldersons, it was a legal claim. With the Prestons, it was the debt. With me," he stopped. "With you, he's tried the straightforward offer and been turned down multiple times," Eliza said. "So he's looking for a different angle." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's what I think." "I think he's found one," she said. "I just don't know yet what it is." She showed him the page with 14 entries. He read it without speaking, and when he got to the end, he set it down on the desk and sat looking at it for a moment the way people sometimes looked at things that confirmed what they'd feared. "You got all this in 8 weeks, he said. 8 weeks and a lot of what Ruth told me," she said. "I still don't have enough. The pattern is visible, but I can't prove intent yet. And without intent, what I have is a story about a businessman who benefits from other people's misfortune, which is not illegal." "So what do you need?" "Documents. she said. Specifically, anything that shows the same people making decisions that benefited Blackwell consistently. The judge, whoever reported the Garvey beef contract issue to the fort, whoever filed the original boundary claim against the Aldersons. People don't do things like that out of nowhere. There's money moving somewhere, or favors, and money leaves traces. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You think you can find it? I think someone needs to try, she said. And I think I'm the person in the best position to do it, because Blackwell thinks I'm just a bookkeeper who wandered out here from Cheyenne, and people underestimate bookkeepers. He didn't say anything to that. He picked up his coffee cup and drank what was left of it, and then he stood up and took the cup to the kitchen, and when he came back to the doorway, he said, Don't stay up too late. We've got the supply wagon coming at 6. I know, she said. I arranged the supply wagon. He almost said something else. She could see it in the slight hesitation at the doorway. Something on the edge of thank you or be careful. Something that didn't quite make it out before he nodded once and went down the hall to his room. She turned back to her ledger. She added a 15th entry. Then she closed the book and went to bed. The first public move Blackwell made was smaller than she expected and more personal than she'd prepared for. It started with a man named Denton, who worked at the assayer's office and also apparently talked at the barbershop. She didn't know Denton by name at first. She only knew that something had shifted in the way people in Red Hollow looked at her when she came to town. A degree colder and with something new in it, something that wasn't just skepticism about a woman doing a man's job. This was different. This had the particular texture of a rumor that had been told to enough people that it had begun to feel like common knowledge. She found out what it was on a Thursday when she came into the feed store to finalize the renegotiated supply contract, and the owner, a man named Claude Metz, who had been prickly with her from the start but had recently moved from prickly to borderline cooperative, greeted her with a closed face and said he wasn't sure the contract terms they'd discussed were going to work after all. She asked why. He looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Metz wasn't a subtle man, and if he'd been doing something he'd chosen to do, he'd probably have just been blunt about it. He looked like a man who'd been told something and wasn't sure whether to believe it and didn't like being in that position. There's been some talk, he said, about the accounts at the Double R. She waited. Specifically, he said, and he had the grace to look like he'd rather be having almost any other conversation, about some discrepancies. In the figures. What figures? She said. I don't know the details, he said. I only know what I heard. Then tell me what you heard, she said, keeping her voice level, and I'll tell you whether it's accurate. He told her. The version that had been circulating was that Eliza had been adjusting the Double R's financial records in ways that made things look healthier than they were, and that Caleb hadn't noticed because he didn't understand accounts well enough to see it, and that the real situation at the ranch was considerably worse than anyone knew. No one could say exactly where the information had come from. It had simply arrived, the way stories arrive in small towns, through enough mouths that the source became invisible. Eliza stood at the counter in Claude Metz's feed store and felt something cold and clarifying move through her, the way cold water clarifies things that heat has made murky. Mr. Metz, she said, I'm going to do something right now, and I'm going to ask you to pay attention. She opened the satchel she'd brought and set the Double R's current ledger on his counter, along with the last 3 months of supply invoices, the bank statements for the same period, and the draft of the renegotiated contract they'd been working toward. Every number in this ledger corresponds to a document, she said. Every payment, every invoice, every balance. Not one of them has been altered. If you want to verify that, you can take these to anyone in this territory who can read a financial record and ask them to check my math. I'll wait. Metz looked at the papers on his counter. He didn't reach for them. He was doing the calculation that people did when they were deciding how much trouble it was worth it to them to investigate something versus how much easier it was to just avoid the thing that had become complicated. The contract we discussed was a fair rate, she said. 12% better than what you're currently getting from the Double R, because I found a secondary supplier and used the comparison to negotiate. That benefits you. The talk you've been hearing doesn't change the math. She held his eyes. I'll leave the documents here for an hour. If you want to look at them, look at them. If you want to verify anything, I'll arrange it, but I'm not going to let this contract fall apart because someone decided to start a rumor. She stepped back from the counter and waited. Metz looked at the ledger. He looked at the invoice pile. He picked up the draft contract and read through it again, which told her he'd read it carefully at least once before and was using the rereading as cover for making up his mind. After 3 minutes, he set it down and said, "I'll need until Friday to confirm I can hold the new pricing." "Friday's fine," she said. She picked up the other documents, put them back in her satchel, and left the ledger on the counter. She walked out into the street and went directly to her horse and stood there for a moment with her hand on the saddle, not getting on yet, just breathing. The rumor was Blackwell's work. She had no evidence of that either yet, but the pattern was consistent. Undermine the person who's protecting the asset, make the asset's owner doubt the person, create enough uncertainty that the whole arrangement becomes more trouble than it's worth. She got on her horse and rode back to the ranch, and she told Caleb that evening at dinner what had happened. He put down his fork. The line of his jaw went tighter. "I'll go talk to Metz," he said. "I already handled it," she said. I'll tell him directly what I think of Caleb." She said his name the way you said a name when you needed someone to stop for a second and hear you. Going in there angry is what Blackwell wants. It makes you look like a man whose judgment is compromised. It turns a rumor about my bookkeeping into a story about you losing your temper over a woman, and then the rumor about the bookkeeping doesn't even matter anymore because there's a better story. She paused. "The only thing that defeats this is the numbers being right. I've got the numbers right. Let that do the work." He picked up his fork again. He didn't eat right away. He sat with it in his hand and looked at his plate with an expression she was starting to recognize. The expression of a man who had lived alone long enough that being told what was strategically sensible felt slightly unfamiliar, even when he could see it was correct. "It's not just business to him anymore," Caleb said quietly. "It used to be. When he first started making offers, it felt like business. He wanted the water rights, he made offers, I declined, and I thought eventually he'd move on to something else. But he didn't." He paused. After the third decline, he stopped being polite about it. Said in front of 3 men at the saloon that I was a fool who'd die alone on that property, and it'd be sold for debt within 5 years. He set the fork down. A man says that in public, it stops being about land. She understood what he was saying. The water rights were the reason. But something between Blackwell and Caleb had become the fuel, and fuel burned hotter than reason. "The personal piece is what he's counting on," she said. "He wants you to do something that gives him a legal or reputational opening. Stay steady." Caleb looked at her across the table. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy at all," she said. "It's just necessary." He almost said something. The look that crossed his face was complicated, something between frustration and a kind of reluctant trust that hadn't been there when she'd arrived, that had developed in the small daily accumulations of weeks, the same way most real things developed. He nodded once and picked up his fork again, and they ate the rest of dinner without talking, which was not uncomfortable the way silences sometimes were. It was just quiet. The contract with Metz was confirmed on Friday, as she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was who was standing outside the feed store when she went to sign it. Victor Blackwell was there with 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed men who had the look of people who had come from somewhere larger than Red Hollow for a specific purpose. They were examining the facade of the building next to the feed store, a vacant space that had been a saddlery before the owner moved east 2 years ago. Blackwell was gesturing at the storefront with the particular ownership-adjacent confidence of a man who was describing something he already considered his. He saw her. He didn't look away or pretend he hadn't. He said something brief to the 2 men and walked over to her with his hand extended and his pleasant face arranged into pleasantness. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I don't think we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," she said, and shook his hand because not shaking it would have been a display she wasn't ready to make in the middle of the main street. "Victor Blackwell, I imagine you've heard the name." "I have," she said. "Good things, I hope." He smiled in the way of a man who knew that wasn't likely and didn't particularly mind. "How are you finding Red Hollow?" "I find it manageable," she said. "And the work at the Double R? Caleb treating you fairly?" "Mr. Rourke is a reasonable employer," she said. She kept her voice pleasant and her face neutral, which required a certain amount of internal effort that she did not let reach the surface. Glad to hear it. He paused, and the pause had something deliberate in it, the beat before a man says the thing he came over to say. I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore. I've been in business in this territory for a long time, and I have a genuine regard for Caleb Rourke. Even if we've had our disagreements, I'd hate to see someone in your position. He let that sit for a half second. Someone new to a complicated situation, end up on the wrong side of it through no fault of their own. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate the concern, she said. My door is always open, he said. If you ever want a conversation about the practical realities of the situation here, I think you'd find I'm more reasonable than my reputation might suggest. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He nodded pleasantly and walked back to his two men, and Eliza went into the feed store and signed the contract with hands that were entirely steady. The threat had been polite and indirect and completely clear. He was offering her a way out, or rather, a way to his side. And the offer itself was the warning. He was telling her that he knew she was a problem and that he was, for now, still choosing the civilized approach. She filed that away with everything else. The next 2 weeks moved fast, the way things move when multiple problems are developing at the same time, and each one requires attention that you don't fully have to spare. The first problem was the hay supply. Her February shortfall projection had been correct, and the price on the secondary supplier she'd identified was starting to climb as other ranchers in the area came to the same conclusion about winter. She moved on it quickly, got the order placed and the price locked before it jumped further, and it cost more than she'd wanted but less than it was going to cost if she waited. Caleb authorized the expenditure without argument, which was progress of a kind. In the early weeks, he'd had a tendency to question her numbers twice before accepting them, not because he thought she was wrong, but because the habit of running everything himself had made him slow to trust another person's arithmetic. The second problem was a hand named Briggs, who'd been with the R for 3 months, and who Eliza had noticed over several weeks was consistently at the edges of things he didn't need to be at the edges of. He was never where he was supposed to be when she came through the barn to check the work roster against the actual work being done. He was always somewhere close to the records room door when she was inside it. She hadn't said anything yet because she didn't have anything specific enough to say, but she'd started keeping the personal ledger in her room rather than the desk. The third problem was that Blackwell's 2 well-dressed associates had been in town for 2 weeks and showed no signs of leaving. She found out what they were from Ruth Harmon, who came by again on a Saturday with preserves and intelligence in roughly equal measure. They were attorneys, apparently. Not from the territory, from back east, a firm with a long name that Ruth's husband, Thomas, had heard mentioned at the bank and hadn't been able to repeat accurately, but which he associated with the kind of property litigation that didn't stay local. 2 territorial attorneys from back east meant someone was preparing something complicated, and complicated preparations took time, but they also eventually had to arrive somewhere. Thomas thinks it's the water rights, Ruth said, some kind of legal claim. There's been a surveyor out on the eastern boundary of the R. He saw him from across the creek last Thursday. Caleb, who had come in from the barn while Ruth was talking, stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the specific stillness of a man controlling a response. The boundary is documented, he said. It's been the same for 22 years. I know that, Ruth said. Thomas knows that. But legal claims don't need to be right to be expensive and time-consuming to fight. After Ruth left, Caleb stood in the kitchen for a moment. Eliza watched him from the table without saying anything, because sometimes a person needed a moment before words were going to be useful. My wife chose this land, he said. Not to Eliza specifically, more like saying it to the room or to himself. She picked the location. She's the one who found the creek, figured the water rights, decided this was the place. Spent 2 years fighting weather and dry supply lines and bad cattle prices to make it work before it actually did work. He turned toward the window. Signing it away would have been, she never would have... He stopped. The sentence didn't go anywhere because it didn't need to. No one is going to sign anything, Eliza said. He turned and looked at her. I need something from you, she said. I need access to every original deed and property document you have. Not the copies, the originals. And I need to know if anyone else has ever had physical possession of them, even briefly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to his bedroom and she heard the sound of something being moved. Furniture, the heavy, deliberate sound of a chest or cabinet, and he came back with a locked box that had been under the floor beneath the bed. He set it on the table. He had the key on his watch chain. He opened it. The documents inside were old and carefully kept, each one in a separate paper sleeve. He'd maintained them the way a person maintained things they understood were not replaceable. She went through them slowly and carefully, reading each one and checking it against what she already knew of the property's legal history. It took most of the afternoon. Caleb sat nearby for the first hour and then went back to work, but he didn't go far. At the third hour, she found it. Not a problem, exactly. Not yet. But a gap. A period of about 3 months in the ownership documentation chain from 18 years back where there was a gap in the recording sequence. A routine refiling that should have happened and appeared not to have. Or at least there was no document confirming it had happened in the box. It was probably nothing. Recording gaps happened, but it was the kind of nothing that a skilled attorney with bad intentions could use as a starting point for something, if he knew to look for it and if the territorial records matched the gap. She sat looking at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote it down in the personal ledger and circled it twice. Because if Blackwell's attorneys had found it before she had, and she had no way of knowing yet whether they had, then she wasn't 3 weeks ahead of the next move. She might already be behind it. She didn't sleep much that night. The gap in the documentation chain sat in her mind the way a loose tooth sits in a jaw. Not unbearable, but impossible to stop returning to. She lay in the dark in the back bedroom of the Double R and went through what she knew about territorial recording procedures, which was more than most people knew and possibly not enough for what she was dealing with. A missed refiling from 18 years ago could mean several things. It could be clerical, something that should have been done and simply wasn't, lost in the ordinary failures of frontier administration. It could be something that was done but recorded in a different location, a secondary office, or a transferred file. Or it could be something that had been removed, deliberately, by someone who had known about it long before Eliza Whitmore arrived in Red Hollow. She got up before dawn and sat at the desk in the records room with the lamp and the open ledger and worked through the timeline again. If Blackwell's attorneys had found the same gap, and they had access to the same public territorial records she did, probably more access, then they were building something around it. A legal challenge to the property boundary or the ownership chain would take time to file and longer to move through any legitimate court. But the filing itself would accomplish things regardless of the outcome. It would cloud the title. It would make the Double R's ownership uncertain on paper, even temporarily, which would affect Caleb's ability to borrow against the property, which would affect the ranch's operating flexibility, which would create exactly the kind of financial pressure that had preceded the loss of the Garvey land and the Alderson land. The mechanism was different, but the result was the same. Squeeze until something gives. She wrote it out in sequence in the ledger because writing it in sequence made it real and made the holes visible. The hole right now was proof. She had a gap in a document chain. Blackwell had 2 attorneys and presumably a plan. She had a theory that fit the evidence and no way yet to make that theory into something that could walk into a territorial court and stand on its own. She needed the original territorial record for that 3-month period, not a copy, the original or a certified transcript, which would require a trip to the territorial records office and a reason to be there that didn't announce what she was looking for before she found it. She also needed, she was realizing, to stop working alone. Caleb came into the kitchen at 5:30 and found her already at the table with coffee made and her ledger open beside her. He looked at the ledger, then at her, then at the lamp still burning because she hadn't noticed the daylight coming. "You slept," he said. "Some," she said, which was close enough to true that she didn't feel she was lying. He poured coffee and sat down across from her in the chair that had become his chair for these conversations and waited. Because in the time she'd been at the Double R, he had learned that she usually had something to say and that it was better to wait for her to say it than to push. "I need to go to the Territorial Records Office," she said, "in Cheyenne. I need to look at the original filing records for this property from 18 years ago, specifically a 3-month window where there's a gap in what you have in the box." He was quiet for a moment. "You think Blackwell's people found the same gap?" "I think it's possible. And if they're building a legal claim around it, I need to know what the original record actually shows before they file anything, because once they file, we're reacting to their story instead of telling our own. He drank his coffee. How long would you need? 4 days there and back if the roads are dry. Maybe a day in the office, depending on how cooperative the clerk is. She paused. I'd need authorization from you to access the records on behalf of the property. A letter, notarized. I'll write it today, he said. Purcell at the telegraph office does notarizations. He set down the cup. I don't like you going alone. I'll be fine. It's not about whether you'll be fine, he said, and the way he said it was direct but not overbearing, which was a distinction she'd learned to appreciate about him. Blackwell knows who you are and what you're doing. If his people see you heading to Cheyenne, then they'll know I've found the gap and I'm moving on it, which changes their timeline. She hadn't fully thought through that implication until she said it out loud. She sat with it for a second. Or they'll try to interfere with what I find when I get there. Yes, he said. That's what I'm thinking. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the window, where the early light was now fully established and the yard was coming visible. The barn, the corral, the bunkhouse with its single-lit window, where the remaining hand, a quiet man named Pharaoh, was presumably already awake. I'll go as soon as the authorization is ready, she said. And I won't go through Red Hollow. I'll take the East Road. He nodded. Then he said, I'm going to ask Thomas Harmon to come over while you're gone. I don't want the ranch to be short on people right now. She'd noticed that he had a way of making protective decisions that didn't present themselves as being about protection. He framed them as operational. More people on the ranch, a different road to Cheyenne, so they didn't have to become a conversation about whether she needed protecting, which was a conversation neither of them wanted to have. That makes sense, she said. Also, Briggs. Caleb looked at her. I've been watching him for 2 weeks, she said. I don't have anything specific, but he's not where he's supposed to be too often, and he's been too interested in this room. She kept her voice even. I might be wrong. You haven't been wrong about much, Caleb said. She closed the ledger. I'm not saying fire him. I'm saying while I'm gone, keep the documents from that box somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Caleb's expression did something she couldn't quite name. A tightening around the eyes that wasn't anger but was adjacent to it. The look of a man adding a new piece to a picture he didn't like, and having the picture become clearer. I'll handle it, he said. She left 2 mornings later before the town was properly awake, on the East Road with the authorization letter in her satchel, and enough supplies for 6 days because she'd rather have too much than need more than she had. The morning was cold in the way that October mornings were cold out here. Not brutal yet, but with a reminder in the air of what was coming. The horse she'd been using, a solid bay mare named Cass that Caleb had pointed her toward early on and that had turned out to be exactly what a person wanted in a working horse. Steady, opinionated about certain things, but not dangerously so, moved well on the empty road. She made good time the first day and camped where the road crossed a shallow creek, and she lay awake for a while listening to the dark before she slept. And what she thought about was not Blackwell or the documents or the gap in the filing record. She thought about the photograph on the wall in Caleb's hallway, the dark-haired woman with the quiet expression, and about how Caleb had said she chose this land, and about how a person's choices became the architecture of the people who came after them. How Caleb had been shaped by that woman's choices in ways he probably couldn't fully see, the way we're all shaped by the choices of people who aren't here anymore to explain themselves. She thought about her own choices too, which she tried not to do too often because the ledger on those was complicated. She had been, for a long time, a person who was very good at her work and less good at most everything else that people generally considered important. She had left 2 engagements, one in her mid-20s to a lawyer in Denver who'd wanted her to stop working because wives of lawyers in Denver didn't work, and one a few years after to a good man in Nebraska who hadn't asked her to stop working but had, with increasing frequency, asked her to work somewhere that was closer to him and smaller and less unpredictable. She had not been able to do that either. She didn't think she'd been wrong in either case. But she'd spent enough nights alone on enough roads to know that being right about your own choices and being happy about them were different things. She slept eventually, and in the morning she got back on the road. The Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne was a two-story stone building on a side street off the main boulevard that had the particular smell of paper and old ink and slightly damp storage that she associated with places where important things were kept without quite enough care. The clerk at the front desk was a small man of perhaps 60 with half-moon spectacles and the air of someone who had been asked too many questions over too many years and had developed a highly refined way of seeming unhelpful while technically cooperating. She laid the authorization letter on his desk. She explained what she needed. He read the letter slowly, in the way that people read things when they want you to understand that reading things slowly is within their power. He told her the records from that period were in the lower archive, and that the lower archive required a formal request form, and that the request form would be processed in 3 to 5 working days. She told him that she was prepared to wait and that she would appreciate any assistance he could offer in expediting the process, and she said it in a specific tone of voice, not aggressive, not pleading, that she had developed over years of dealing with clerks in records offices, a tone that communicated clearly that she knew exactly what she was asking for, and that she had all day, and that she was not going to go away. He looked at her over the spectacles. She looked back. He processed the form in about 40 minutes. The lower archive was cold and smelled worse than upstairs, and the filing system had been reorganized at some point in the past decade by someone whose logic she had to spend 20 minutes figuring out before she could move efficiently. She found the correct box for the period in question and carried it to the reading table and went through it page by page. The gap was there in the territorial record too. The routine refiling that should have completed the chain was absent. But what was also there, in a folder she had to dig for behind a misfiled land survey for a completely different property, was a notation in a different hand, not the primary clerk's formal handwriting, but someone's smaller, quicker script, that said, "See Consolidated Transfer File, reference 1871-C-44. She went back to the clerk and asked about consolidated transfer files from 1871. He looked at her in a way that suggested he hadn't expected her to find that notation, or perhaps hadn't known it was there. It took another hour to locate file 1871-C-44, and when she opened it, she sat very still for a moment and read what was in it twice. The refiling had been done. It had simply been done under a consolidated reference number that had then been misfiled in a completely different section of the archive. The chain was intact. The property ownership documentation was complete. There was no legitimate gap, only an administrative complication that someone who knew the archive's filing system could have discovered, and who, if they had, would have known that pointing to the apparent gap while not disclosing the existence of the consolidated file would create a legal challenge that would appear devastating to anyone who hadn't found what she'd just found. She sat in the cold archive with the file in her hands and thought about the fact that Blackwell's attorneys had almost certainly been in this archive already. They were thorough people working for a thorough man. They had found the gap in the main filing sequence. The question was whether they had also found file 1871-C-44. She thought about the misfiling. The notation was in a different hand, smaller and harder to find. If you were looking for a gap to exploit and you found what looked like one, you might not keep looking. You might stop where you needed to stop. She asked the clerk for certified copies of both documents, the original filing sequence and the consolidated file with its cross-reference, and she asked for them to be sealed and formally notarized by the office. The clerk seemed to have developed a slightly different attitude toward her than he'd had that morning. She wasn't sure whether it was reluctant respect or simple exhaustion with the situation. Either way, he produced the certified copies and the notarization without the 3 to 5 day processing time. She put the sealed documents in the inner pocket of her satchel, beneath her personal ledger, beneath the spare water canteen, and she thanked the clerk and walked out into the Cheyenne afternoon with something that felt carefully like the first solid ground she'd found since she'd started looking. She was 2 hours outside of Cheyenne on the return road when she understood she was being followed. She didn't see anyone. That was how she knew. The road behind her had the particular empty quality of a road that should have had occasional traffic and didn't, as if everything had cleared the space behind her in a deliberate way. She slowed Cass once and listened and heard nothing that she could specifically point to, and then the hair on the back of her neck told her something that she couldn't specifically point to, and she trusted that more. She didn't change her pace dramatically. Changing pace would confirm she'd noticed. Instead, she made a slight adjustment to her route at the next fork, taking the slightly longer southern road rather than the direct northern route. And she watched the landscape for the rest of that afternoon with her peripheral vision and paid attention to where the road bent and where it opened and where cover was and wasn't. Nobody approached her. She stopped for the night at a small station house that offered board to travelers, paid for a room with a lock, and slept with the satchel under her pillow. Not because that was comfortable, which it was not, but because the alternative was sleeping without it, and that was worse. She arrived back at the Double R on the fourth day in the late afternoon and found Thomas Harmon in the yard talking with Caleb, and both men turned when she came through the gate with the look of people who had been waiting and were now trying not to look like they'd been waiting. She dismounted and handed Cass off to Pharaoh, who came forward to take the reins, and she met Caleb's eyes and gave him a small nod that meant she'd gotten what she went for, and she saw him let out a breath that he'd probably been holding for days without fully knowing it. "Something's happened," she said, reading his face more carefully. "While I was gone." "Come inside," he said. Briggs was gone. He'd left the second night after she'd gone to Cheyenne, taking his gear and his payode. And also, Caleb said, the rough copy of the property survey she'd had pinned to the wall of the records room. Not the original. Not anything that couldn't be reconstructed, but something that showed the boundary lines and the location of the creek and the water rights notation that she'd put there as a working reference. He was careful about it, Caleb said. They were at the kitchen table. Thomas Harmon had excused himself to check on something in the barn in the tactful way of a man giving people space. Took only what wouldn't be missed right away. I only noticed the survey copy because I knew to look. Did you move the documents from the box first? Night before he left, Caleb said. They're in a different location. Good. She sat with it. He was there from the beginning to watch, probably reporting back. Whatever he took, Blackwell already knows the ranch well enough that it doesn't give them much they didn't have. The survey copy shows the creek's exact position relative to the boundary markers. They have a surveyor who's already been on the east boundary, she said. They know where the creek is. Then why take it? Because taking it shows they're past the information gathering stage, she said. They're building something now. They needed the survey as part of a filing. Caleb's hands, flat on the table, pressed down slightly. How close are they? Close, she said, and then she opened the satchel and took out the sealed envelope from the Territorial Records Office and set it between them. But I found something they may not have found, or may have found and chose not to disclose. She explained the consolidated file, the misfiled cross-reference, the completeness of the ownership chain that the apparent gap had suggested was broken. She explained what it meant for any legal claim built on that gap, that the claim would be built on a misrepresentation, and that she could now demonstrate the misrepresentation with certified original territorial records. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the sealed envelope for a long moment. So if they file, he said slowly, and we have this, then their attorneys have filed a claim that contradicts the certified territorial record, she said, which is not just a failed lawsuit. That's misconduct, potentially criminal misconduct, depending on whether they knew about the consolidated file when they filed. Did they know? I don't know yet, she said. But I think we need to find out, and I think we need to find out quietly and quickly before they get to the filing stage. He looked at her across the table. The afternoon light was going, and neither of them had lit the lamp yet, and the kitchen was in that particular half-dark that made things look both clearer and heavier than they were. He looked tired. Not just today tired, but the kind of tired that settles into a person after a long time of holding a position alone, of keeping everything going through force of will, because there wasn't anything else to do it with. When I hired you, he said, I thought I was hiring someone to fix the feed contracts. She almost smiled at that. The feed contracts needed fixing. Yeah, he said. They did. He was quiet for a moment. I need to say something that's going to come out wrong, probably. Say it anyway. I don't ask for help well. I know that. Margaret used to say I treated needing help like it was the same thing as failing, and she wasn't wrong. He stopped. It was the first time he'd said the name out loud, and she felt the weight of it without needing to respond to it. I've been watching what you've been doing these past 3 months, And I keep waiting for the part where I should have handled it myself, where I should have done this before you got here. And the part doesn't come. You're... He stopped again. I'm trying to say I'm glad you came, and that I should have said it before now. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Thomas Harmon's voice and Pharaoh's voice were carrying from the barn in the way of two men talking about work, the specific, comfortable murmur of people doing something ordinary. You hired me provisionally, she said, subject to a face-to-face meeting. I remember. I'm going to suggest we stop thinking of it as provisional, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was careful, and also, underneath the careful, something that wasn't careful at all. I'd agree to that, he said. She picked up the sealed envelope and tapped it against the table once, gently. Then let's talk about what we do next. Because the filing is coming, and when it comes I want to be standing in front of it, not behind it. She reached across and lit the lamp. The kitchen came back fully into visibility. The table, the two coffee cups, the satchel still open at her side, the sealed envelope with its notarized edges catching the light. And she opened the ledger to a fresh page and picked up her pen and said, Tell me everything you know about who Victor Blackwell has in his pocket in this territory. Names, positions, connections, all of it. Caleb leaned forward and started talking, and she started writing, and outside the wind was picking up ahead of something that was coming whether they were ready for it or not, which meant they needed to be ready for it. She wrote faster. The list Caleb gave her that night ran to 2 pages. Some of the names she recognized from the documents she'd already worked through. The judge who'd ruled in Blackwell's favor 4 times. A man named Creel, who sat on the Territorial Land Board and had been appointed to that position 3 years after Blackwell's bank financed the construction of his house. A freight company owner who'd held the exclusive contract to move goods in and out of Blackwell's properties for the better part of a decade. Others were new to her. A deputy marshal in the county seat whose brother-in-law managed one of Blackwell's eastern parcels, a newspaper editor in the next town over who had published 3 separate editorials in the past 2 years questioning the financial stability of ranchers in the Red Hollow area without naming anyone specifically, but using language that anyone who knew the situation would recognize. She wrote all of it down. Caleb talked for over an hour, and she could tell as he went that he was pulling up things he'd thought about individually, in the isolated way a man thought about problems when he had no one to think about them with, and that putting them together in sequence for someone else to hear was doing something to him, making the whole shape visible in a way it apparently hadn't been before. You've known about most of this for years, she said when he finished. I've known pieces of it, he said. I didn't have it laid out like that. You could have hired someone, an attorney, someone to look at it. He was quiet for a moment. I know that. I kept thinking it wouldn't come to a filing, that he'd find something else to put his energy toward, or that eventually he'd make an open move and I'd fight it directly. He looked at the 2 pages she'd filled. I'm not good at fighting things I can't see. Most people aren't, she said, not unkindly. That's what he's counting on. She took the 2 pages and added them to the section of her ledger she'd titled People, which already had Ruth Harmon's contributions and her own observations in it, and she looked at the full picture for the first time with everything she'd gathered since arriving. The pattern was there. It was clear. The same small group of people appearing at strategic moments in each of the 3 property acquisitions. Creel on the land board finding procedural grounds to delay legitimate filings, the judge available whenever a claim needed to move quickly through his court, the newspaper editor creating a background noise of financial doubt that made sellers look like they were getting out ahead of inevitable failure rather than being pushed out by deliberate pressure. She needed documentation of the connections, not just the pattern. She needed something that showed money or instruction moving from Blackwell to these people around the time of each acquisition, because pattern was still a story, and story wasn't evidence. But she was closer than she'd been. And they were, she reminded herself, also dealing with a filing that might be coming fast, which meant she couldn't spend weeks chasing the deeper corruption case while the immediate legal threat went unanswered. She needed to do both at once, which meant she couldn't do either of them alone. And gun. She went to see Ruth Harmon the next morning. Thomas was at the property when she arrived, mending a fence line at the near edge of the pasture, and he raised a hand when she rode past, but didn't stop his work. Ruth was in the kitchen, and she looked at Eliza's face when she came through the door and put the kettle on without being asked, which was its own kind of conversation. "I need to ask something of you that's bigger than I have a right to ask," Eliza said when they were at the table. "Ask it," Ruth said. "I need to talk to the families who lost their properties to Blackwell, the ones who will talk to me. Specifically about any documents they signed, any interactions they had with the judge or the land board, anything that felt wrong at the time but that they couldn't do anything about." She paused. "And I need it soon, within the week if possible." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The Prestons are in Laramie now. I can write to them, but mail takes time." She thought. "Garvey's son, Daniel. He's still in the county, works at the mill in Faro Creek. He was the one who dealt with the Fort contract loss. His father was already sick by then. And the Alderson girl, Clara, she married a man named Webb, and they're on a small place about 8 miles east of here." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I'll go with you to see them. They'll be more willing to talk with me there." "I was hoping you'd say that." "What are you building?" Ruth asked. "Something that can be sent to the territorial attorney's office in a form they can't ignore," Eliza said. "Not just the property claim defense. The whole picture. Everything Blackwell has done here, with documentation wherever I can find it, with witness statements where I can't, organized so that it's clear and impossible to dismiss as grievance." She paused. "It won't be enough on its own, but combined with the certified records from Cheyenne, and if the filing they're preparing turns out to be built on the misrepresentation I think it is, then they're not just losing a lawsuit," Ruth said. "They're facing questions about how the lawsuit came to exist." "Yes," Eliza said. Ruth drank her tea. She set the cup down with the precise care of a woman making a decision. "Give me 2 days to arrange it," she said. "I'll send word to Daniel Garvey today, and I'll go to Clara Webb myself tomorrow morning." She looked at Eliza. "You should know that some of these people have spent a long time trying not to think about what happened to them. It's one thing to survive something, it's another thing to go back into it in front of a stranger." "I know," Eliza said. "I'll be careful." "You should also know," Ruth said more quietly, "that Blackwell has reach in places I don't fully understand. If he finds out you're talking to these people—" "He's going to find out eventually," Eliza said. "I'd rather he finds out when I'm already done." Ruth nodded. It wasn't a comfortable nod. It was the nod of a woman who understood that sometimes the choices available weren't between safe and unsafe, but between two different kinds of risk, and who had made enough of those choices in her life to recognize one in front of her. The legal filing arrived on a Tuesday, 10 days after Eliza had returned from Cheyenne, delivered to the county records office in a sealed envelope from an attorney firm in St. Louis whose letterhead carried 4 names in serious type. Purcell sent word to the ranch. Caleb rode to town and got a copy of the filing and brought it back and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and they sat there for a moment with it between them like something that had teeth. She opened it. She read it through once fast and then again slowly. The claim was a boundary dispute, as she'd expected, citing the gap in the recording sequence as evidence of an incomplete property transfer that left a portion of the Double R's eastern boundary, the portion along the creek, legally unsettled. It was carefully written. The attorneys knew their business. The argument was built on the apparent gap in the main filing sequence, exactly as she'd predicted, and it made no reference to the consolidated file that resolved the gap, because either they hadn't found it or they had found it and were hoping she hadn't. She set the document down. "Well," Caleb said. "It's what I expected," she said. "The argument is built on the gap. The certified copy I brought back from Cheyenne directly contradicts their central premise." She tapped the filing. "If we respond to this quickly, with the certified records and a clear explanation of the consolidated file, this claim fails. Then we respond quickly." "We need an attorney to file the response," she said. "Not from here. Not someone Blackwell has a relationship with." "There's a man in Laramie," Caleb said. "Hendricks. He helped me with a contract dispute 6 years ago. He's not connected to anyone here. Can you get to him this week?" "I'll ride tomorrow." She nodded. She looked at the filing again. "There's something else," she said. "Look at the date on the filing. It was prepared 9 days ago. That means they had it ready before Briggs left with the survey copy. Caleb looked at the date. They didn't need the survey for the filing. No, she said. They had everything they needed before they sent Briggs in, which means Briggs was never about getting information for the filing. He was there for something else. They both sat with that. The personal ledger, Eliza said slowly. He was near the records room too often. Not the ranch ledger, mine. He wanted to know what I knew and how much I'd documented. The implication sat between them like a cold draft. If Blackwell knew the extent of what she'd compiled, the pattern, the names, the connections, he would know that the legal filing alone wasn't sufficient to stop her. He would need a different approach. I need to move the evidence file, she said. Not here. Where? She thought about Ruth. She thought about the Harmon property. Solid, established, with Thomas Harmon, who was not easily moved, and who had a reputation in this county that predated Blackwell's arrival by 15 years. Ruth and Thomas, she said, a copy of everything, held there, and I need to get it there tonight. Caleb didn't argue with her about it, which she noticed and appreciated. He just said, I'll saddle Cass. She spent that afternoon making a clean copy of the full evidence file, the 14-page pattern analysis, the witness summaries from Daniel Garvey and Clara Webb that she'd taken the previous week with Ruth beside her, the financial connections she'd traced through the public bank records, the names and dates and cross-references, and she organized it with the same care she'd organized everything from the beginning so that a person who knew nothing about this situation could pick it up and follow it. Daniel Garvey had been harder to reach than she'd expected, and not because he was unwilling. He was willing. He'd been waiting, she thought, for someone to ask, the way people waited for permission to say the thing they'd been carrying. He'd described the fort contract loss in detail, how the notification had come from the fort quartermaster with no prior warning, how the stated reason was a quality complaint that he'd never been given specifics about, how he'd tried to appeal it and been told the decision had come from above the quartermaster's level, from a territorial supply authority he'd never heard of. He'd given her the dates and the name of the quartermaster and the name of the supply authority, and when she cross-referenced those against the timeline of Blackwell's first offer on the Garvey land, the supply authority's ruling had come 16 days after that offer was declined. Clara Webb had been quieter about it. She'd been 17 when her family lost the land, and she'd had a 17-year-old's partial understanding of what was happening around her, which meant her memory was more emotional than documentary. But she remembered one specific thing clearly because it had frightened her at the time, and the fright had kept it sharp. A man she didn't know had come to the house the week before the boundary claim was filed against them, and he had spoken to her father privately, and when he left, her father had been shaking in a way she'd never seen before. Her father had died the following year, and she'd never found out what the man had said. She gave Eliza his description, which was not Blackwell and was not either of the attorneys, but which matched, in 3 specific details, the description of the deputy marshal whose brother-in-law managed Blackwell's eastern parcel. She included all of it in the copy. She sealed it. She rode to the Harmon place as the sun was going down with the sealed package in her coat and gave it to Ruth, who locked it in the strongbox where Thomas kept the title to their own property, which was the safest place either of them could think of on short notice. She was back at the Double R before full dark and found Caleb in the barn finishing the evening work, and she stood in the barn door and said, "It's done." He looked up from what he was doing. "The copy's with Ruth?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, holding the brush he'd been using. One of the horses shifted in the stall beside him, and he put a hand to the animal's neck without looking at it, the automatic comfort of someone who had worked with animals long enough that it had become reflex. "I keep thinking," he said, "that this should have been something I handled before it got to this point, before you had to go to Cheyenne and compile 16 pages of—" He stopped. "You handled it for 4 years," she said. "You held the property and kept the operation going and didn't sign anything you shouldn't have signed. That's not nothing." "It's not enough either." "No," she said, "it wasn't. But you don't have to have done everything right to deserve what you're trying to protect." He looked at her with that particular look he had, the one she'd been learning to read, where there was more happening beneath the surface than made it to the face, and he knew it, and wasn't sure what to do about it. Caleb, she said, and she said it gently because he'd earned that. Ride to Laramie tomorrow. Get Hendricks working on the response. Let me handle the rest of this. You shouldn't be handling it alone. I'm not alone, she said. I've got Ruth and Thomas and Daniel Garvey and Clara Webb and a certified copy from the Territorial Records Office and 16 pages of documentation. I'm the least alone I've been since I got here. He almost smiled. Almost. That's a strange way to put it. It's accurate, she said. He put down the brush and came out of the stall and latched it behind him. And he stood for a moment in the space between them that was smaller than it used to be and seemed to be getting smaller in the gradual organic way that spaces between people got smaller when they spent enough time in proximity to each other. Be careful, he said. I'm always careful, she said. That's not what I've been observing. She laughed at that, and it surprised her, the realness of it, how readily it came. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at something in a barn at the end of a complicated day. He left early the next morning for Laramie. The fire at the Harmon barn happened that same night. She heard about it at noon the following day from a neighbor boy who came riding to the Double R with the news, and she was on Cass and moving before he'd finished the sentence. She arrived to find the barn already down to smoldering timbers, and Thomas and Ruth and two hands standing in the yard with the particular stillness of people who had stopped being in motion because there was nothing left for motion to accomplish. No animals had been in the barn. Thomas had moved them to the pasture the previous afternoon because of the forecasted cold, which meant that whoever had done it had either not known that or hadn't cared. Either way, the barn was gone. Ruth was standing slightly apart from the others, and when Eliza dismounted and came to her, Ruth's expression was the expression of a woman who was past shock and into something harder and steadier. The strongbox, Eliza said. In the house, Ruth said. Whoever did this went for the barn, not the house. The copy is intact. Eliza felt something release in her chest that had been tight since the neighbor boy had arrived. Are you all right? I'm angry, Ruth said. I am very, very angry. She looked at the smoldering timbers. That barn was 30 years old. Thomas's father built it. Thomas was talking to one of the hands, his voice low and controlled in the manner of a man managing himself carefully. He looked over at Eliza, and something passed between them that didn't need words. He knew what the fire meant in the context of everything else, and so did she. This is because of me, Eliza said, because I asked you to keep the copy here. No, Ruth said flatly. This is because of Victor Blackwell. Don't make the mistake of moving the cause. She turned to look at Eliza. What do we do now? The copy is safe, Eliza said. I need to get word to Caleb and Laramie, and I need to... She stopped. She was looking at the ruins of the barn and thinking about what the fire meant strategically, which was they were past gathering. Blackwell knew she had something, and he was now willing to do something criminal and visible to stop her, which meant he was scared, and scared people made decisions based on the near future at the expense of the longer one. I need to send the evidence file to the Territorial Attorney's Office, she said, not wait for the legal response to the filing to go through first. Send it now, while Blackwell's people are still thinking they're ahead of us. Can we do that? Ruth asked. Without an attorney? We can file a complaint, Eliza said. A citizen's complaint with supporting documentation. It doesn't have the same force as an attorney's filing, but it creates a record, and a record means that whatever comes next has to happen in front of that record. She paused. I need a day to organize the full package, and I need you and Thomas to make sworn statements about what you've witnessed here. Not just tonight, everything. Thomas will do it, Ruth said, without needing to ask him. So will I. They went inside. Ruth made coffee because that was what Ruth did when things were bad, which Eliza had come to understand was not a small gesture but a real one. The maintenance of ordinary things when ordinary things were under threat. Eliza sat at the Harmon kitchen table and opened the sealed copy she'd left in the strongbox and began adding to it. She wrote out the arson at the Harmon barn. Date, time, description of the damage, names of witnesses. She wrote it in the same clear, organized way she'd written everything else. Not dramatically, just factually, the way facts were most useful. She was on her third page when a rider came to the Harmon gate. Not a neighbor boy this time. A man she didn't recognize, well-dressed for a ranch road, with a sealed letter that he said was for Miss Whitmore. She opened it at the table with Ruth watching. It was from Blackwell. Not through an attorney, from him directly, handwritten, which was either confidence or miscalculation. She wasn't sure which yet. It was brief. It said that he was aware she had assembled certain documents and that he believed a conversation between them, privately, would be to the benefit of both parties. It said that he had information regarding the double R that she was not yet aware of and that this information was relevant to any decision she might be making. It said he would be at his office in Red Hollow the following morning and that he hoped she would come. She read it twice. She set it on the table. "Well," Ruth said. "He wants a meeting," Eliza said. "Don't go." "I'm going to go," Eliza said. Ruth opened her mouth. "He said he has information I'm not aware of," Eliza said. "If that's true, I need to know what it is before I send the package to the territorial attorney. And if it's not true and it's only a tactic to delay or intimidate me, then going and walking back out again intact sends its own message." She looked at Ruth. "I'm not walking in there without knowing what I have. And right now what I have is a very complete file and a certified document from Cheyenne and sworn witnesses. That's not nothing to walk in with." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You're going to take the original personal ledger with you?" "No," Eliza said. "I'm going to take a copy of the summary page and leave the rest here." She looked steadily at Ruth. "If I'm not back by noon tomorrow, send the full package to the territorial attorney's office by the fastest rider you can find. Don't wait for me to return first." Ruth looked at her for a long time. "You understand what you're walking into." "I understand what he thinks I'm walking into," Eliza said. "Those are different things." She spent the rest of that evening finishing the evidence package, organizing it for the last time into its final form. Complete, clean, cross-referenced, with the certified Cheyenne documents at the front and the witness statements behind them and the full pattern analysis at the back with its supporting documentation. She sealed it carefully. She gave it to Ruth and watched Ruth put it in the strongbox and lock it. Then she went home to the double R and sat in the records room at the desk where she'd worked for the past 4 months, and she looked at the 4 walls of that small room and at the lamp and at the empty desk surface, cleared now of everything that had accumulated there, and she thought about what Blackwell's information might be, and whether she'd thought of everything, and whether there was anything she'd missed. She thought she hadn't missed anything. She also knew that thinking you hadn't missed anything was not the same as not having missed anything, and that the difference between those two states was sometimes very large and sometimes cost people everything they were trying to protect. She lit a second lamp and went through the ledger one more time, slowly, from the first entry to the last. At 11:30 she closed it, put it in her coat pocket, and went to bed. She needed to be clear-headed in the morning, and whatever Victor Blackwell had to say to her, she intended to be the most clear-headed person in the room when he said it. She rode into Red Hollow at 8:30 in the morning with the summary page folded in her coat pocket and the personal ledger beside it, and nothing else she couldn't afford to lose. The town was doing what small towns did at that hour, opening up, going through the motions of ordinary morning commerce. And she rode past the feed store and the hotel and the telegraph office and the people who glanced up and then looked away or didn't look away. And she didn't pay particular attention to any of it. She had a specific thing to do, and she intended to do it and come out the other side with whatever Blackwell had decided to tell her, and then she was going to ride back to the Harmon property and make a decision about the package in Ruth's strongbox. Blackwell's office was above the bank, accessible by a separate staircase on the building's east side. The door at the top was open. A man she didn't recognize sat in the outer room and showed her in without speaking, which was either efficiency or theater, she wasn't sure which. Blackwell was at his desk. The room was well appointed without being ostentatious. A man who wanted you to register competence rather than display. He rose when she came in and gestured to the chair across from him, and waited until she sat before he did, which was the kind of courtesy that meant very little, but which some men used as an opening bid. She looked at him directly and waited. "Thank you for coming, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I wasn't certain you would." "You said you had information relevant to my decisions," she said. "I need to know what I'm deciding about." He looked at her with the considering expression of a man calibrating how direct to be. He'd done that calculation before with her. She remembered the street outside the telegraph office, the offer dressed as a warning. This felt different. The pleasant face was present, but there was something underneath it that was tighter than she'd seen before. "I know what you've been building," he said. "I know about the Cheyenne documents and the witness statements and the complaint package. I know it's comprehensive." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Briggs was useful, but he wasn't invisible, and I suspected you'd notice eventually." "What I noticed," she said, "was that he was never very good at pretending to work." Something shifted in Blackwell's expression at that, not quite humor, but an acknowledgement of a point. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "No," she said. He blinked. It was involuntary. The small surprise of someone who'd prepared for a negotiation and had the negotiation decline before it started. "You haven't heard it," he said. "I don't need to," she said. "Whatever the offer is, it requires me to stop what I'm doing or give you something or go away. I'm not going to do any of those things, so the offer doesn't have a recipient." She kept her voice even. She wasn't performing calm, she was actually calm, which she found slightly surprising but didn't examine. "You said you had information I wasn't aware of. That's why I'm here. If you have it, tell me what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up a pen from his desk and set it back down in a gesture that had no purpose except to give his hand something to do while he made a decision. "The forged document," he said. She went very still. "Margaret Rourke," he said, and watching his face say that name, a name that belonged to a dead woman on a wall in a hallway, took something from her that she hadn't expected. She signed a letter of intent 20 years ago, before the full property title was established. My attorneys found it in the Preston estate records. Chester Preston held a joint grazing agreement with Rourke at the time, and the letter was filed in his paperwork. He opened his desk drawer and took out a document and set it on the desk facing her. "It isn't a deed transfer, but it's a written statement of intent to sell the eastern water rights if the property ever changed primary ownership." She leaned forward and looked at the document without touching it. The handwriting looked right. The date looked right. The signature at the bottom had the quality of something real, not too perfect, not too faint, with the slight inconsistency of a real person's real hand. She sat back. "Caleb doesn't know about this," Blackwell said, "and I'm telling you about it now instead of leading with it in the legal filing because—" He paused, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that wasn't managed, something that was almost discomfort. "Because I've been in this territory for 30 years, and what's in your package, Miss Whitmore, would make the last 10 of them very difficult to explain, for me and for people I have obligations to." So that was it. That was the real shape of the meeting. He'd found a weapon that would hit Caleb personally, and he was using it as leverage to negotiate a way out of the corner she'd backed him into. "You want me to keep the package quiet," she said. "I want a conversation," he said, "about what's possible for everyone." That document," she said, nodding at the paper on his desk. "Can I examine it?" He turned it fully toward her. She picked it up. She read it carefully. Twice. The way she read everything important. She looked at the date in relation to what she knew about the property's history, the timeline of the Preston grazing agreement, the timeline of Margaret Rourke's death, the timeline of the property's full title establishment. She looked at the signature and the witness mark beside it, and the notation at the bottom that she almost missed because it was small and written in a slightly different ink. There it was, a notary stamp, barely visible, pressed too lightly, the way notary stamps looked when the stamp was old or the ink was insufficient or someone had pressed it with deliberate lightness because they needed it to register but didn't want it to be the first thing someone looked at. She knew that stamp. Not this specific instance of it, but the shape of it, the identifying number on a territorial notary stamp, which was unique to each authorized notary. She had looked at a great many notary stamps in the past 4 months. The number on this stamp was registered to a notary in Cheyenne who had died in 1869. The document was dated 1871. She set it back on the desk with the same care she'd picked it up. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely before you respond." She looked at him steadily. "This document is a forgery. The notary stamp on it belongs to a man who died 2 years before the date on the document. I know that because I spent a day in the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne last week, and notary registrations are filed in the same archive as property records, and I look at everything. She paused. Which means you've just shown me the commission of a crime in addition to everything already in my package. The color in Blackwell's face changed. Not dramatically. He was a man with too much practice to react dramatically, but something drained out of it that had been there a minute before. The attorneys, he started. I don't know whether your attorneys prepared this or whether you did, she said. That's going to be a question for someone else to sort out, but I know what I'm looking at. He was very quiet. Here's what I think happened, she said. I think you had most of your legal strategy prepared before you sent Briggs to the ranch. I think the filing was ready. I think this document, she nodded at it, was your contingency. The thing you'd produce if the legal filing didn't move fast enough or if I turned out to be harder to stop than you expected. She paused. I think you're showing it to me now because you're trying to find out how much it changes my calculation. Whether the personal piece of it, Caleb finding out his wife might have agreed to something he never knew about, might slow me down. Blackwell said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that was past strategy and into something more basic. It doesn't slow me down, she said, because it isn't real. She stood up. The package goes to the territorial attorney's office today, she said. I'm adding this conversation to it, and the document you showed me, and the notary registration discrepancy. If your attorneys filed the boundary claim knowing about the consolidated file in Cheyenne, that's misconduct. If this document was prepared for use in legal proceedings, that's fraud. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. I'm going to give you the same advice you gave me when we met on the street. My door's open if you want a conversation about the practical realities of the situation, but I think you're going to find the practical realities have changed somewhat since you sent that letter. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he said, Miss Whitmore. She stopped but didn't turn fully around. I have a wife, he said. Eleanor. She doesn't know the details of how I've operated. I'm not saying that to ask for anything. I'm saying it because she's a decent woman who made the mistake of marrying me 25 years ago, and she doesn't deserve... He stopped. Whatever happens to me is going to happen to her too. She turned then, because that required a response that she needed to look at him to give. I can't control what happens to Mrs. Blackwell, she said, and I'm not going to soften what I send so that the consequences for you are smaller. I don't have that in me, and you know exactly why. She held his eyes. But if your wife has her own knowledge of what you've done, if she's willing to speak honestly about what she knows, that cooperation tends to matter to people with authority. That's the only thing I can tell you. She walked down the stairs and out into the morning street and got on her horse and rode without stopping to the Harmon property. Ruth was in the yard when she arrived and read her face before she dismounted. Send it, Eliza said. Everything, today. Thomas had a rider ready within the hour, a young man named Cole who had ridden territorial mail routes before and knew the fastest road to the county seat and from there to Cheyenne. The package went with him, sealed and addressed, and with a cover letter that Eliza wrote at the Harmon kitchen table in the clearest language she could manage, explaining what was inside and why it required urgent attention and what the certified documents from the Territorial Records Office demonstrated about the pending legal filing. Cole left before noon. Eliza sat at the table for a moment after he was gone, and Ruth set coffee in front of her and sat across from her, and they didn't say anything for a while, which was the right thing to do after something like that. He showed me a forged document, Eliza said finally, about Margaret Rourke. Ruth's expression changed. About the property? About the water rights. A letter of intent, supposedly signed by her. She explained the notary stamp. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Eliza had come to genuinely value about her. The capacity to hear something fully before responding. Caleb needs to know about this, Ruth said when she finished. I know, Eliza said. That's the part I've been sitting with. He's still in Laramie? He should be back by tomorrow if he's riding hard. Then you have until tomorrow to figure out how to tell him, Ruth said, not because you need the time to soften it, because you should be the one who tells him, and you should do it properly. Eliza nodded. She drank the coffee. She thought about the photograph on the wall in Caleb's hallway. the woman with the dark hair and the quiet expression, and about how a forged document with a dead woman's name on it was its own particular kind of violation, the kind that didn't just threaten property, but reached into something more private and couldn't be simply filed away and addressed. Caleb arrived back the following afternoon with Hendricks, the attorney from Laramie, who was a compact, precise man in his 50s who read the filing and the certified Cheyenne documents and said, in the understated manner of a man who'd seen a great many things but was still capable of genuine assessment, that this was one of the more comprehensively prepared property defenses he'd encountered in 30 years of territorial law. Eliza told Caleb about the meeting with Blackwell that evening, after Hendricks had gone to his room at the hotel in town. She told him in the kitchen, directly, the way she'd told him everything else, without softening the structure of it, because softening the structure would have been a disrespect dressed as a kindness. She told him about the document, about Margaret's name on it, about the notary stamp and what was wrong with it. He sat across the table and listened, and his face went through things she watched without trying to manage. There was anger, and there was something beneath the anger that was more complicated and more painful than anger. The specific pain of having a dead person's name used as a weapon against you. The violation of it, the reaching quality of it that went past business into somewhere much more personal. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. She wouldn't have, he said. Not arguing with Eliza, just saying it to the room. She fought for that land harder than I did in the early years. She would not have agreed to sign away the water rights under any circumstances. I know, Eliza said. That's why he had to forge it. Caleb's hands were flat on the table, pressing down the way they did when he was keeping himself at a controlled distance from something he wanted to respond to physically. He used her name, he said. Yes. He sat in that office and showed you her forged signature and offered it to you as a bargaining piece. Yes. The quiet that followed was different from the other quiets in that kitchen. It had weight in it and heat underneath the weight, and Eliza sat with it without trying to fill it, because there were moments when silence was doing the necessary work and interrupting it was the wrong choice. After a while, Caleb said, I want to go to his office. I know you do, she said. I'm not going to, he said. I'm saying I want to. I'm telling you that so you know I know the difference. I know you know the difference, she said. He looked at her. You've handled everything exactly right, from the beginning, every step. He paused. That's not easy to say to someone, for me specifically, but it's true, and you should hear it. You held this ranch together for 2 years alone, she said. You kept the property intact and the operation running, and you didn't give him anything to use against you legitimately. That's why we're still here having this conversation instead of somewhere else having a different one. He was quiet again, but this time the quiet was different, less heavy, something working itself out. Hendricks thinks the legal filing will be dismissed within 60 days given the certified documents, he said. That's my read too, she said. And the package you sent to the territorial attorney, that's a different timeline and a different process, she said. It's not going to be fast. Investigations aren't fast. But the record is there now, and that matters more than the speed. He nodded slowly. He looked at the table. He looked up at her. I owe you more than I know how to say, he said. You don't owe me, she said. I work here. That's not what I mean. She held his eyes. I know what you mean. The lamp between them was burning low, and neither of them moved to adjust it. And the room did what rooms sometimes did when two people had been through enough together that the ordinary furniture of the place started to feel different than it had. Not charged exactly, just more present, more real than before. Stay, he said, not as an employee, not as just stay. She'd known this was coming, in the way you knew things that had been developing slowly over months, and she'd thought about how she'd respond, and she was finding now that the response she'd prepared in the abstract was not quite the response she had in the actual moment, which was different and less careful and more honest. Caleb, she said, I'm not easy to live with. I work too many hours, and I don't ask for help well either, and I have strong opinions about feed contracts. I've noticed all of that, he said. And I don't stay places because someone wants me to, she said. I stay because there's work worth doing and people worth doing it with. Is there? He asked. Here? She looked at him across the table. This man she'd spent 4 months learning to read. This man who'd brought her food without needing acknowledgement for it and had written a notarized letter and trusted her to ride to Cheyenne alone and had told her about his dead wife without making it into an appeal for sympathy. This imperfect, careful, complicated man who'd been carrying too much alone for too long and had known enough to finally ask for help, even when asking for help felt like failing. "Yes," she said. "There is." What came after was not simple or quick, because real things rarely were. The legal filing from Blackwell's attorneys was formally contested in the first week of November, with Hendricks presenting the certified Cheyenne documents, and the judge, not the judge from Blackwell's list, a different judge from the county north of Red Hollow, who had no recorded connection to any of Blackwell's interests, took 40 days to issue a ruling, which was faster than Hendricks had expected and considerably slower than Caleb had hoped. The ruling dismissed the boundary claim entirely on the grounds that the ownership chain was documented and complete, and it included a notation about the apparent discrepancy between the claim's central premise and the certified territorial record that Hendricks told them, in the careful language of a man who didn't like to overstate things, was the kind of notation that tended to attract attention from people whose job it was to pay attention. The territorial attorney's office in Cheyenne acknowledged receipt of the evidence package in December. A formal investigation was opened in January. Eliza knew this not because anyone told her directly, but because 2 investigators arrived in Red Hollow in the second week of January and spent 4 days talking to people. And one of the people they talked to was Claude Metz at the feed store. And Metz came to the R afterward with an expression that was partly uncomfortable and partly something closer to relieved. And he said that he'd told them what he knew, which wasn't everything but was what he'd directly witnessed, and he'd thought they should know he'd been honest. Eliza thanked him and meant it. Daniel Garvey made the trip from Faro Creek in February to give his statement to the investigators in person. Clara Webb gave hers in writing, witnessed and notarized, with a specificity about the man who'd come to see her father, she's the deputy marshal's identifying details, that Eliza understood had cost her something to put on paper and that she'd done it anyway. Ruth and Thomas Harmon gave statements about the fire and about what they'd witnessed in the broader pattern of Blackwell's behavior in the valley. And Thomas, who was not a man who said things he didn't mean, told the investigators that Eliza Whitmore had done more in 4 months to document what had been happening in Red Hollow than the official apparatus had managed in a decade. And he said it in the plain way of a man stating a fact. Victor Blackwell was formally charged in March. Not with everything, not with all of it, because real investigations found some of what they looked for, and not all of it, and real justice was imperfect in ways that were sometimes infuriating and sometimes simply had to be accepted. He was charged with fraud relating to the forged document, with the arson at the Harmon barn through a chain of evidence that connected back to a man who'd been paid and who, when faced with the full weight of what he was facing, became suddenly willing to say who'd paid him, and with 1 count of conspiracy relating to the boundary claim filing, which the attorneys who'd prepared it complicated considerably by having detailed memories about whose instructions they'd been following. The judge from Blackwell's list, the one who'd ruled in his favor 4 times over 8 years, was separately referred to a judicial review board. That process was slower and quieter, and Eliza heard about its progress in fragments over the following months, and she didn't know for a long time whether anything would come of it. Eventually something did, but by then other things had happened and the judge's professional troubles were one thread in a larger cloth that she had mostly stopped pulling at, because it was no longer necessary to pull. Eleanor Blackwell came forward in April. She came not to the investigators directly but to Eliza, which surprised her, and on reflection shouldn't have. She arrived at the R on a Tuesday morning without announcement, a woman of 50 or so with a composed face and careful clothes and eyes that had seen more than they'd been permitted to say for a long time. And she sat at the kitchen table and said that she wanted to give a statement and that she wanted to give it to the person who had put this in motion before she gave it to anyone else. And she wanted to understand first whether her cooperation would be recorded as such. Eliza told her she couldn't make any promises on behalf of the investigators, but that cooperation of this kind was generally recognized for what it was by people with the authority to do something about it. Eleanor Blackwell nodded once, and then she talked for 2 hours. What she knew was different from what Eliza had documented because she'd known it from the inside. from 25 years of proximity to a man she had once loved and had stopped being able to love somewhere around the time she understood that his business practices had destroyed real people in real ways that she had watched unfold from close range, and had not. And this was the piece she said with the most difficulty, the piece she had the most trouble with, had not said anything about, because she had told herself it wasn't her business, and that she didn't know the details, and that wives of powerful men didn't undermine their husbands in this valley, and because, plainly, she had been afraid. Eliza listened to all of it. She didn't offer absolution because it wasn't hers to give. She didn't tell Eleanor that she understood, or that anyone in her position might have done the same, because she didn't know whether that was true, and she wasn't going to say something just to make a hard thing more comfortable. She poured tea and she listened, and when Eleanor finished, she told her that what she'd said mattered, and that the people whose properties had been lost and whose lives had been complicated by what she'd witnessed deserved to know that someone who'd been close to it had finally been willing to say so. Eleanor looked at her across the table with an expression Eliza would think about later, something complicated and exhausted, and underneath the exhaustion, something that might, over time, become something like integrity, finding its way back to the surface. "I should have said something years ago," Eleanor said. "Yes," Eliza said, "you should have. But you're saying it now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't condemnation either. It was just the truth. And the truth was what Eleanor had come for. And Eliza wasn't going to dress it up into something softer just because Eleanor's situation was genuinely difficult. After she left, Caleb, who had been outside during the conversation, came in and poured coffee and sat down and looked at Eliza across the table. "How was that?" he said. "Hard," she said. "For her. She's going to have a very difficult year." "She knew," he said. Not angrily, just factually. "She knew and she didn't stop it," Eliza said. "Those are both true. And now she's trying to do the only thing she has left to do, which is be honest about it." She picked up her own cup. "People are rarely only one thing, Caleb. That doesn't excuse the things they did wrong, but it's true." He looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more of lately. Not the restrained, evaluating look of the early months, but something more open than that, something that had been made possible by 4 months of daily proximity and difficulty and shared purpose. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "What?" "That first day. You walked 3 miles from town because you didn't want to wait." She looked at him. "I still don't like waiting." "I know," he said. "I'm starting to think that might be one of the things that makes you—" He paused, the way he paused when he was finding words for things he didn't usually say. "Formidable. That's the word." "Formidable," she repeated. "Is that all right?" "That's more than all right," she said. Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always did, gradually, then all at once, with mud first and then color in the hills and the creek running high from the snowmelt and the horses spending longer in the pasture because the grass was finally worth being in the pasture for. The Double R came out of winter in better financial shape than it had gone in, which was partly the feed contract and partly the supply restructuring and partly the fact that they'd had more hands through the cold months than Caleb had managed in the 2 winters before. Because the word had gotten around, gradually, in the way good information moved through ranch country, that the Double R was a solid operation that paid what it owed and kept its commitments. Thomas Harmon built a new barn. It went up in 3 days with help from 6 ranchers in the valley who came out on their own initiative, and Ruth fed everyone twice a day, and nobody talked about what the old barn's loss meant, or how the new one came to be necessary, because some things were better honored by action than by conversation. Eliza stood at the edge of the Harmon property and watched the barn go up and thought about what it took to build something, the material of it, the labor, the decision to do it again after the first one burned, how the decision was both simple and not simple at all, how most of the real things in life had that quality, the apparent simplicity that held a great deal of difficulty inside it if you looked close enough. She thought about her sister Agnes in Kansas City and the letter she'd have to write that would be different from the letters she'd written before. Less guarded, more honest, with information in it that Agnes would find surprising and probably would not entirely understand, because Agnes's life had taken a different shape, and the shape of a life determined what a person could see clearly from where they stood. She'd write the letter. Agnes would write back with worry and questions. They'd go back and forth the way they'd always gone back and forth, and it would be imperfect and unresolved and ongoing, which was what having a sister was. Caleb came to stand beside her at some point in the afternoon watching the barn go up, and they stood there without talking for a while in the way of people who had come to be comfortable in each other's silence. "I've been thinking about something you said," he said eventually. "I say a lot of things. Early on," he said, "when I asked you about the rumors, you said you'd been talked about in 6 states and you were still here. I remember. I want you to still be here," he said, "not as—" He stopped. "I keep starting sentences I can't finish when it comes to this." "I know," she said. "You can finish them." He was quiet for a moment. The sound of hammers from the barn site carried across the field between them. "I want this to be yours," he said. "The ranch. Not as payment. Not because of the work you've done, which was— I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what I want it to be, going forward, what I want to build here. With you." She looked at the ranch in the middle distance and thought about the first time she'd seen it, coming up the road from Red Hollow, with her single worn bag and her provisional acceptance, and the particular tired resolve of someone who had been starting over in new places long enough that starting over had become, if not easy, at least familiar. She thought about the records room and the 14 entries in the ledger and the ride to Cheyenne and the cold archive and the notary stamp on a forged document. She thought about Ruth's kitchen and Eleanor Blackwell's exhausted face and Clara Webb writing out what she'd carried since she was 17. She thought about the photograph on the wall in the hallway and about choices becoming architecture and about what it meant to build a life deliberately rather than arriving in it by default. "I want that too," she said. He looked at her. He had, she'd observed, a way of looking at her that was not the way he looked at anything else. More direct, less guarded, with the quality of something he'd stopped trying to manage. "I'm not good at this," he said. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Neither am I," she said. "I'm better at feed contracts." "I know," he said. "We'll work on the rest." She thought about what she knew about building things, that it was slow and imperfect and required showing up on the days you didn't feel like showing up, and that the showing up was usually the hardest part and also the most important, that nothing worth having arrived already finished, that the gap between what a thing was and what you wanted it to be was not a failure, but a direction. The hammers kept going at the Harmon barn. The afternoon light moved across the valley in the way. Afternoon light moved in this part of the territory, wide and unhurried, touching everything equally, the creek and the pasture and the hills and the 2 people standing at the edge of a field watching other people build something out of what had been lost. She'd come to Red Hollow with a worn bag and a provisional acceptance, and the certain knowledge that no room she walked into was going to receive her without requiring her to prove something. She had proved things, in the end, but not only to the people she'd needed to prove them to. She'd proved something to herself, too. Not that she was capable, she'd known that, but that she was willing to stay. That was the thing she'd been circling for years without naming it, not the competence, which she'd never doubted. The willingness to stay when staying got complicated, to put down the kind of roots that meant you had something to lose, to be part of a place rather than just passing through it. There were people whose properties had been taken who weren't getting them back. The Prestons in Laramie, the original Garvey land. You couldn't undo what had been done to them, and justice when it came would be partial and slow and would not restore what had been taken. That was the part she sat with at odd moments. The part that didn't resolve cleanly, that stayed uncomfortable regardless of what had been accomplished. Daniel Garvey was still working at the mill in Faro Creek. Clara Webb was still on the small place with her husband, not the land her family had farmed. The investigation would do what investigations did, and what they did was establish accountability, which mattered, but accountability was not restitution, and she knew the difference. She held that knowledge the way you held things that were true and difficult at the same time. Not to dismiss it, not to be undone by it, but to let it inform how you went forward, because going forward was the only direction available, And the only real question was whether you went forward with clear eyes or without them. She went forward with clear eyes. That was what she could control, and it was enough. The hammers stopped at the Harmon barn as the afternoon tipped toward evening, and the people who'd been working gathered at the edge of the new structure and looked at what they'd built together. Rough and solid and new, smelling of fresh-cut timber, standing in the place where the old one had burned. Not the same as before. Something different. Something that wouldn't have existed without the loss that preceded it, which was not a reason to be grateful for the loss, but was a reason to look honestly at what had come from it. Ruth appeared at the barn door and called that there was food, and people moved toward the sound of her voice. Caleb put his hand on Eliza's arm briefly, not a gesture that announced itself, just a quiet, grounded contact, the kind that meant, I'm here and you're here, and that's what we're working with. And then he moved toward the barn, and she walked beside him. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the stage in Red Hollow 7 months ago. Not better, exactly. Not worse. Just changed in the way that a person was changed by doing hard things alongside people worth doing hard things with. By choosing, repeatedly, and in full awareness of the cost, to stay. The evening opened up around them as they walked, wide and clear, the way evenings in this part of the territory could be wide and clear in a way that made you feel the size of things without being made small by it. Just present, just there. That was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.